All right, so we've had a little bit of a lull in people wanting to join from the waiting room, so I think now is a good time to get us started, but I will continue to admit people as they come in. Um, my name is Jennifer Magnuson, and I am with the Northwest Aquatic and Marine Educators, and I would like to extend a very hearty welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight. We're really excited to kind of rekindle and restart our virtual speaker series. And I would like to turn it over to Gloria, who has been the beating heart of this reinvigoration of this speaker series. She has worked tirelessly to come up with some amazing speakers and really get the word out there. And we are really excited to see some new faces and hope that this offering will help keep everyone engaged with the education that we're working with here at NAME. So Gloria, I would like to turn it over to you to introduce and let people know what's going to happen tonight.
Okay, well, I too want to really welcome all of you who are marine educators. And also, I want to send a really big thank you to those of you who are not per se marine educators, but who are supporting the work of the marine educators. We really, really do really appreciate your support. So in thinking about this evening, we felt that it was really important to have a traditional speaker give us a blessing, a prayer before Nancy's talk. So I'm really happy to be able to introduce to you my friend Caleb Child, who is Quag Youth from Fort Rupert. So the Quag Youth are First Nations, and they are part of the Kwakwaka'wakw Federation of the people who speak the Kwakwala language. And Caleb's indigenous name is Moose Gumsey. And we just found out tonight that that means 6 whales piled on top of one another. So learn something new here tonight. And Caleb is currently the CEO of the Wassenach, hope I pronounced that right, secondary school on the Saanich Peninsula, which is about 25 kilometers north of Victoria. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome my really good friend, Caleb Child, who I like to call my cousin Caleb. So Caleb, who's Gumsey?
Yula Kesla Gloria. Yula Kesla Dlidlatol Sisapwala. Nugwa Muskamzi, Gayutanlak Tsachis, Quagilton. Friends and relatives, it's truly an honor to stand alongside you this evening for a tremendous occasion as we embark on more than a 50-year journey in the inspiring, transformative spirit of Dr. Nancy Turner. And as Gloria mentioned, my name is Moose Gumsey. It makes reference to 4 whales piled on top of each other. And I too learned tonight that Galich Samga, which is one of many names that Dr. Nancy carries from our Kwakwaka'wakw peoples, making reference to beached whale woman. And so just want to recognize the cultural community connections that are represented across the Zoom mosaic of where you participate from as ancestral communities, recognizing traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories. It's customary to acknowledge our beginnings, acknowledge our origin stories. And as a Quagilth person, I too am a guest in Saanich territory. So just recognizing the traditional territories of all of us and where we participate from. And really the opportunity as a fellow educator, someone who's been able to follow the path and the footsteps of Dr. Nancy Turner and Dr. Gloria Snively and so many that have come before us, and truly setting a path for tradition and caretaking and nurturing the environment around us, seeing ourselves as part of a system versus overseer. And so as we come into the work this evening, I had the tremendous pleasure as a traditional singer to share a brief song of welcome. It's known to our communities as Dlualacha or Klasla, which we commonly call peace dances. They're songs of honor, they're songs of friendship, and they're songs that we sing in order to commemorate our connections and our family relationships. And so I'm going to share a brief Kwagil song. It belongs to one of our chiefs and Kwagil families from my wife's side of the family. And it speaks to the potlatch and gift-giving traditions of many of the nations on the Pacific Northwest coast. And the connection I make tonight is as we introduce Dr. Turner, she truly has been and continues to be a potlatch maker and a gift-giving ambassador to the work this evening. So as we ground ourselves and as we come into the work, I just ask that you reflect on who you are and where you come from, and the gifts that each of you bring to our circle. Gila Kasla. Thank you so much for the opportunity to witness the beautiful work this evening, and welcome to this evening's session.
So that was beautiful, Caleb. Gala Kasla. Thank you so much. So it's also my honor to introduce Dr. Nancy Turner, who really doesn't need a lot of introduction because she's so well known, so renowned. She's somebody who manages to integrate ethnobotany with studies of biology, ecology, geology, anthropology, linguistics, and so on. So a little bit of everything to have a really holistic view of what it is that she's studying. Nancy was a faculty member in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria, and I really feel honored to have worked with Nancy a number of times at the university, especially serving on graduate committees. And I can really say that Nancy is just a real pleasure to work with. Really, really nice person. So I'm just going to say that amongst her many, many accomplishments and publications and co-publications, I just want to want you to take a look at these two books. See how big they are? They're just amazing, these huge books. This is a monumental work, Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge, volumes 1 and 2. They're huge. And these were published in 2014. And Nancy's been busy doing more research, publishing more articles, and creating new research projects. So Nancy never quits, which is just wonderful. And of course, she's won numerous prestigious awards, which I don't need to list at this point. So I'm just going to welcome Nancy. Welcome. We're so happy that you're joining us here tonight.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and what an honor to be able to present this information to such a great audience as this. I'm going to run through some slides. Although you are marine educators, some of this will pertain to terrestrial environments as well, but you can see how it all fits together, hopefully, by the time I finish my talk. So first of all, I want to raise my hands to all of the First Peoples of this region, of the Salish Sea and Vancouver Island, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, the Coast Salish peoples, and to recognize the millennia of caretaking that people have brought to this land and to these waters. And I just want to recognize that. Haichka, Hawa, Gilakasla, Tleiko, Tleiko. I want to thank Gloria and Jennifer. And Caleb, it's such an honor to have you here with me and to hear your beautiful song and just to think about all the work that you do for your people and for the environment and for all of us. And I just raise my hands to you. Thank you so much. I want to thank my husband, Bob, and many, many colleagues at the university and elsewhere who I've worked with over the years. You can see here's a photo of where I'm sitting. I can look out the window. The rainbow isn't there, but that's the view that I have. So I'm right on the ocean here on Protection Island. And I just love the ocean and the shoreline here to see the oyster catchers and all of the birds of the water. It's just a real privilege. I've had the privilege of working with and learning from so many wonderful teachers in British Columbia and beyond, but especially here in British Columbia. And I just want to take a minute to recognize and name some of them, starting with Quaxistala, Clan Chief Adam Dick, who was the one who gifted me with the name Galit Simga, and his widow, Kim Merkalmakludacy, who had a look over my talk for me and really liked it. And I appreciated her just checking it out for me. Other elders I've worked with, starting over on the far left, Sam Mitchell from Hatlip, Lillooet, Selena Tamoyakan from the Okanagan, Siilch, Sethlama Joan Morris, my dear sister from the Songhees Nation, Dr. Mary Thomas from Secwepemc Nation, Dr. Margaret Sywallis from the Newhawk Nation, the top corner, Cyril Carpenter from the Heiltsuk Nation, Luschim Dr. Arvid Charlie from Cowichan, Annie York from the Ntlakatmuk Nation, Dr. Ron Ignace from the Secwepemc Nation, and its wife, Mary Ann Ignace, have both been dear friends for a long time. Elsie Claxton from Saanich Nation, Dr. Umik Richard Atleo from the Nuu-chah-nulth Ahousaht Nation, Chief Ernie Hill from the Gitcat Nation, Pauline Waterfall from the Heiltsuk Nation, Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation, and finally Helen Clifton from the Gitgat Nation. These are a few of the people who've been my teachers, and I love them all dearly. Some of them have passed away, but to me, they're always with me. So this evening, I'm going to talk for about maybe 50 minutes, just with an introduction, and then tell you 3 quick stories that of events that kind of changed my thinking about the way people look after their resources and the environment. Talk about traditional ecological knowledge and the way people look after their lands, and give a few examples. And this includes the marine environment, but as I said before, it also pertains to the way people look after forests and other parts of the terrestrial environment as well. So in this region of northwestern North America, there are over 50 different major language groups. And altogether, they use hundreds of different plants and animal species, fish and seafood, salmon, different mammals and birds, and many types of plants for food, materials, medicines, and so forth. And accompanying this knowledge and the use of these species is stories and ceremonies and traditions and relationships that go with, and belief systems that go with them. And there's a strong evidence, as in the books that Gloria mentioned, ancestral knowledge, ancient pathways, ancestral knowledge. There's strong evidence of sharing of knowledge and techniques and values across linguistic, geographic, and ecological boundaries. So these are 2 maps drawn by my friend Dr. Nancy Mackin, and they show northwestern North America, and on the left are the sort of general territories of the 50 different language and major dialect groups that I mentioned, up and down the coast from Alaska down to the Oregon coast. And if you look on the right, it's not as clear, but they're major environmental regions, major ecosystems showing on that map. And if you superimpose those 2 maps, you see you get this tremendous biocultural diversity that makes this area of the world one of the richest in terms of the complexity of knowledge systems that people hold. And of course, you can see it out on the land, all of you out on the lands and waters of your areas, and you know the diversity of forest life and peat bogs and mountaintops and shorelines and offshore on the ocean and so forth, and rivers and lakes. So you get the idea that there's all this diversity in the landscape. And of course, I'm not going to focus on wildlife, but wildlife of all kinds is really important, from fish to insects to all the beautiful mammals that we have, including the white bear, the spirit bear up in the top left-hand corner here. And of course, people have lived here since time immemorial, 14,000 years or longer. And when I first started learning about these people, everyone was calling them hunter-gatherers. And that was a term that was very widely used by anthropologists for this Northwest Coast region. But I've since come to realize that is just a totally simplistic term that doesn't really fit the way people really relate to their lands here. So I started studying ethnobotany and soon realized that you can't just study people and plants, but you have to study the environments and the animals and the fungi and everything as well. So ended up kind of steering my work towards a broader field, which is sometimes called ethnoecology, the study of cultural ecological knowledge. And just in the top left-hand corner, I just noticed there's a picture of Caleb's brother, Tom Child, just to recognize that. Feeding some sea urchin to, I think, to his daughter, maybe. And in the middle is Celilia, Belinda Claxton, Elsie's daughter. And these are just some diverse photos from different parts of this region, showing some of the foods. There's herring eggs on hemlock boughs there. There's oolacans hanging up. There's rockfish and oolacan grease. Halibut hanging there on a rack up at the seaweed camp, the Gitgat Nation at Kiel, and various plants as well. So ethnoecology is a very, as you've probably gathered by now, a very interdisciplinary study. It really includes the cultural knowledge of other species and environments. And it includes everything from linguistics to political ecology, nutrition, restoration ecology, chemical ecology, genetics, and so on. You can see that all of these things have a role to play in our understanding of the way people relate to their lands and the plants, animals, and fungi that they rely on. That's Elizabeth Dundas of the Gitgat Nation. A new food to me, kissu, which she's scraping off with a scraper. It's the inside, the edible inner bark of amabilis fir. But people also eat kissu from hemlock and other trees. My friend Fikret Burkus and I just submitted a book chapter this afternoon to a book on agroecosystems. He's written a couple of books, but probably the best known is Sacred Ecology. And this is his definition, a good definition of traditional ecological knowledge, a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And cultural transmission is not just sitting in a classroom and telling people what they should know, but it's actually learning by doing. And one of my very favorite all-time pictures here is Helen Clifton from the Gitgat Nation with her little granddaughter Janelle, who's all grown up now. But Helen has got a hammer made of yew, and Janelle has a little hammer, and they both hammering halibut walks, which are dried slabs of halibut, to make them soft so that they're more easily consumed. And Janelle is just having fun with her grandma. She doesn't really realize probably that she's actually being taught something, and she'll never forget that. It'll be there every time she thinks of her grandma and looks at a mallet like that. She'll think of how to do that, and it will stay with her for her whole life. So traditional ecological knowledge is a system of knowledge that includes all the practical kind of knowledge. What species can you use? How you eat them? How do you prepare them and harvest them and so forth? But it also includes the way people look at the world, the relationships that they develop with other species and with the environment, a philosophy, if you like. Also ways of passing on the knowledge, as I mentioned, through stories, through ceremony. And you see here a picture of the Atlakima dancer of what's called the grouse dance, which Caleb will know, that Clan Chief Adam Dick organized for us for a conference. And it's a dance that is about teaching a young man not to hunt too many grouse. And he went out, this young man, and grouse are easy to kill, so he killed a lot of them. When he went home, he went to sleep that night, and he was visited by the spirits of the forest, including the grouse himself. And each one of the spirits of the forest taught him about how important it is, how the balance is so important, and how you should never take too much of anything. When he woke up, he knew that he had done the wrong thing, and he learned from that experience. So that's just one way of cultural communication and passing on that kind of knowledge. Governance and institutions, the people who are trained from the time they're very young to look after particular resources or particular areas. And all of this knowledge is always changing and shifting in a cyclical frame that goes over generations and is learned across cultures, across languages, and across generations. Here's just another way of presenting that information, how this knowledge is so holistic. It's not really divided up into table or anything like that, but really it's everything together and with the philosophy and worldview at the very center of it all. In the Nass Valley, some of you might have been up to around the Nass River in the Niska territory. There's a story that the Niska pass from one generation to the next about how long ago some boys were mistreating salmon, treating them cruelly, pouring pitch on them and lighting it on fire and then sending them up the river and then laughing when they could see the fish glowing as they went up the river. And soon after that, there was a big volcano that came and the lava filled the valley and actually covered over the boys' village. And that story is told to this day. And it's a way of teaching young people how you have to respect all of everything, the animals, the plants, and the land. And if you don't, it will come back at you in some way. There will be some kind of repercussions for it. Other deep lessons, one that some of you might know my book, The Earth's Blanket, and this is what it inspired the title for that book. It's notes from ethnographer James Tate from around 1900, and I found this handwritten notes in his notebooks that I had copies of. Flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth sorry, weeps, rains, and angry, and makes rain, fog, and bad weather. So that's another way of teaching people to look after the land and don't take too much and don't waste it, or bad things will happen. And there are all kinds of stories that tell us, about the plants and animals that and how they got there. There's one of my favorites is a story that was recorded by Thomas McElraith from Newhawk elders from way back in the 1940s, how Raven brought soapberries, nuchski they call them there, to the Bellacoola Valley. And he brought them from carrier country. He was invited to a feast, and he was representing the Newhawk people. They went inside a mountain because the chief that invited them was a mountain, and the feast was held inside the mountain, and they served soapberry whip. And Raven, who wanted some for his people, the Newhawk, he grabbed some in his mouth. He turned himself back into his bird form, and he flew out of the mountain, and he flew over the coast mountains and down into the Bellacoola Valley. But then he couldn't stop himself. He was so excited when he got into the valley. He called, and all the soapberry whip came out of his beak and out and fell all over the head of the valley. But he never made it to Bellacoola with the soapberry whip, and that's why you only find soapberries up at the head of the Bellacoola Valley. because Raven couldn't contain himself, and he got too excited and he wasn't able to bring soap berries back. I love that song. It was Elsie Claxton who told me about it and what it means in their language. But all up and down the coast here, the Swainson's thrush is known as a salmonberry bird. And for the Saanich people, what the bird is singing in Sanchathan is this, come on, oh you little dark-headed, red-headed ones. Come on, oh you little white-headed ones. Come on, oh you little red-headed ones. You little blonde, gold-headed ones. Ripen, 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 ripen. That's what the bird is singing. And if you're out, about a month from now, maybe a little more, the salmon berries are just blooming now, but in about a month they'll be ripe. You'll hear the Swainson's thrush singing that song. And this is called a phenological indicator. It's a way of using the life cycle of one species to determine what the life cycle of another is going to be. People use that knowledge all the time, but this is a beautiful example of how just part of that ecological knowledge system. And children are taught from a very early age, you never kill needlessly. Always be thankful for what you're able to take. Never waste and always share. As Roy Hayupas, New Channel elder from long ago, said, the idea and practices of overexploitation are deplorable to our people. The practices outside our realm of values. I have to smile at that picture of Ethan, because Ethan is all grown up now. He's a fine young man up in Hartley Bay. And the knowledge goes to where you go and how you harvest. My friend Mary Thomas talked about the birch bark that she gets for her baskets. You can't just go and take bark from any old place. You have to look for it. It might take a whole day. You need to get just the right kind of bark with not too many long eyelets, or the basket will crack. And you can only gather it at a certain time of the year. And this is just one example, only in late May and June, and then the bark starts to stick back. So when it's ready though, when it's ripe, all you have to do is cut very carefully, not into the wood, but just in through the bark. And you just touch it a little and it pops right off. And I've seen her doing it. It's like peeling your jacket off when it's warm weather. And that the old people know just when to do it. And she talks about how you take the bark when you're cutting the birch bark. You cut it from the side of the tree with the thinnest bark, because in the winter time it splits on the bark splits open on the north side of the tree, and it has little fluffs all the way down. That's the side that you're going to cut it, because you don't want the thin part of the bark to be the bottom of your basket. You want it to be on the edges where you can reinforce it. And so again, I've seen her do that, and it just peels right off. I call that the zipper side of the tree. Well, a story for you. I was with Quaxistala Wachla. He passed away some years ago now, but I still think of him all the time. I can hear his voice. And he was raised in Kinkum, at Gwai village, by his elders. He was held back. He was hidden away when the police came to take children to the residential school. And so he never learned to read or write English, but he learned so much from his elders because they taught him specially. They trained him how to be a clan chief. And one of the things he did as a child, he would go down to the tidal marsh with his mother and grandmother and the other women and help to look after the tidal marsh gardens, the tequila root gardens, the taxus, the dlexam, quani, and hukum, these different plants. It was all important, he said. Here they are. The lupin is and the silverweed, the springbank clover, and the northern rice root, huquam. These are the roots that they used to cultivate down at the mouth of the Kingcome River in the tidal marshes. It was all important, he said. It was my job as a boy to pick them off. He started talking about the huquam, said the gagump, which means grandfather. You take that off the bottom. They throw it back. He told me to throw it back. It's like a cup, and the huquam sits in there. That was my job when I was a kid. I'd never heard of such a thing. So I said, so Adam, is that gagump going to grow into a new plant? Well, yes, that's why we did it. He didn't say, you dummy, but he was probably thinking it. It's so obvious to him that that's exactly what they were doing. And it wasn't until years later that I learned what the gagump was. It's a sprout that grows from the bottom of the rice root bulb. And sure enough, when we planted out those, they do grow into new plants. Meanwhile, I was up working with Dr. Mary Thomas in the Secwepemc territory, the birch bark harvester, and she started talking about going with her parents to dig the schweich root, the yellow glacier lily. She said, yeah, there's a little part on the bottom. They call it the whiskers, and we buried back the little ones. We buried back the whiskers. You clip it and throw it back in the soil where it was growing, so it would grow back again. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then some years later, this is the third story, I was with Cyril Carpenter, and I was riding in his fishing boat with him, and he started talking about his grandmother, who told him that they used to have berry gardens up and in Roscoe Inlet, beside waterfalls. There were places where they brought berry bushes, blueberries, huckleberries, and other berries. They planted them by the waterfall on south-facing slopes, and they buried fish guts and fish remains around them, and charcoal and clams and ashes from the fire, because it was near their salmon camp. And his grandmother told him that, and my friend Pauline Waterfall, her grandmother told her that as well. So we went up that to look for it. Both grandmothers said you could just pull the berries off by the handful. Well, this information was quite different from the hunter-gatherer kind of description that I had been told. We went up, a group of us, to look for the berry garden, and we think we found it up in Roscoe Inlet. The berries were growing really well, even though the gardens hadn't been tended for over 80 years, probably. So the traditional land and resource management is part of the traditional knowledge system, how to look after the resources and maintain them and make sure that you don't overharvest them, sustain them. And you work with natural processes like regeneration and nutrient cycling. And of course, this knowledge and practice is grounded in beliefs and worldviews, and the kinship that we have with other species, and the feeling of responsibility that people have for looking after the other species, especially the ones that are important to people. And there's my friend Cecilia Belinda Claxton harvesting a strip of cedar bark. All up and down the coast there are these culturally modified cedars and other trees as well that have had parts, bark or pitch or whatever, roots, branches taken from them, but maintained as living trees. And that's a mark of this kind of proprietorship that people had towards the species that they used. You don't kill anything, you keep it living. And that's another one of the books that I edited with my friend Doug Doerr, called Keeping It Living, which comes from a Kwakwala word that Clan Chief Adam Dick shared with us. So these are some of the practices that people use to look after the plants and animals. Use of fire to maintain different successional stages and to keep some clearing areas and meadows open. Pruning and coppicing trees and shrubs. Tilling and weeding and selective harvesting. Careful and selective and seasonal harvesting of salmon, clams, deer, and so forth. Replanting and scattering and transplanting propagules. Seed clams and herring eggs. I'll talk about the clams in a minute. Creating habitat through structural alterations like building up terraces. Ownership and proprietorship, so you have someone trained from a very young age to look after particular areas and particular resources. Distributed use and harvesting across the landscape and seasonal rounds, and multi-generational monitoring of plant and animal populations. Based on lots and lots of sharing of knowledge, observation, familiarity with local species, looking to see what bears do, how bears scatter the berries when they harvest them, how when a beaver chews a willow tree, the willow will shoot out new branches that are just perfect for making fish nets. All of those things, scattering the rice root so that it'll grow again. All of those things people would have noticed from way back. There is the word, and I hesitate to try to pronounce it, but it means keeping it living, a new way of looking at traditional food production, and what I've come to call perennial cultivation, because people are cultivating these plants, but they're not cultivating in the way that we with European backgrounds think of as gardens, like Mr. McGregor's garden, with rows of seeds that you plant, radishes and lettuce and so forth. These are perennial species that people rely on, and so they look after them in different ways. And there's this keeping living philosophy all over. As Mary said, when you harvest the birch bark, you have to be very careful that you don't cut through that thin pulp that covers the tree, or the sap will start to come out and you deprive the tree of the sap. So it keeps the tree alive if you don't harvest right down to the growing part of the birch tree, but only the outside bark. Sometimes this is called kincentricity, the idea of that trees and fish and all the other species that we rely on are our kin, they're our relatives. And so these are drawn from way back from Edward Curtis, talking about a tree that you're splitting boards from, and it's actually called begged from. And since trees are believed to have sentient life, the ancients, before obtaining boards in this way, would look up to the tree and talk to it. We've come to beg a piece of you today, please. We hope you will let us have a piece of you. Cultural sanctions against killing trees, recorded by Franz Boas from Quack Quack Quack. They don't take all the cedar bark, for the people said if they did, the young cedar would die, and another cedar tree nearby would curse the bark peeler, so he would also die. That's pretty serious, and that's why you see these trees up and down the coast, the culturally modified trees, some of them 400, 500 years old and still living. Even when you harvest inner bark for food, you just take a strip of the bark, and this is Helena Myers from the Chilcotin Nation, harvesting pine inner bark, or pine noodles, they call it, a delicious and nutritious food. I was in Sweden a few years back with my friend Lars Ostlund, and we found a Scots pine tree that had been harvested by Sami indigenous people in the very same way. So this is a very broad belief system among indigenous peoples. And here ownership, as I mentioned before, is part of management, making sure that you keep an eye on things, on one area or on one resource. So it's not just common property, it's looked after by specific trained people. So for example, my friend Richard Atleo has the proprietorship of the Atleo River near Ahousaht. That's his hereditary responsibility, his hachotli. And the same for the Saanich and other places. There are certain islands that people would go to, and people would oversee and make sure that not too much was harvested at once. Just going on around to different places at different seasons also reduces the impact of our harvesting in one particular place. And I won't go too much into that because the time is getting short. But just again, the philosophy that everything is interconnected is found in many languages, but including Nuchanoth, Hishukish, Tsawak. Everything is one. And the spiritual aspects are part of it as well. The underlying spirit, as I've already mentioned, for the trees, the cedar trees, for example. In Devil's Club, Man, you can see this painting. It's a beautiful spirit of the Devil's Club. In Tsilhqot'in area, there's a ceremony that women were told if they'd lost their spouse, their husband, and they were in mourning and bereaving and they couldn't stop, they were told to go up on the mountain and pull out some of the old stems of the spring beauty, one of their main root vegetables, and throw them around to places where they weren't growing. And we actually were up on the Potato Mountain, and I pulled up some of those old stems and I put them into an envelope, forgot about them for a couple of weeks. When I opened it, there were little black, tiny, shiny black seeds. We planted them, and sure enough, they grow into new plants. So you look at Potato Mountains in Tsilhqot'in territory, and they say, we're the ones responsible for looking after these potatoes at Tsuntani. And it's from our work that they're spread so wide on this beautiful mountain. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll finish with just a few case examples, starting with clam gardens. Some of you have heard about those, and it was actually Clan Chief Adam who was able to actually explain what these strange terrace beaches were when they were discovered by geomorphologist John Harper. John was flying over the beaches up and down the coast at low tide, and he noticed these strange formations with rocks down at the lowest tide level. And he didn't know if they were a natural feature from glaciers or what. But I happened to be with Clan Chief Adam Dick and introduced them. And Adam said, of course, that's our Lokiwe, our clam gardens. And lok means rolling. You roll the rocks down to the edge of the tide. And so that's what one of the experiences that Adam had as a child. He lived with his part of the time out in the Broughton Islands at a place called Deep Harbor with his grandparents. And they had their own Lokiwe there. And we went out there with him and with Kim and a few friends, Doug Doer and others. And Adam actually showed us the clam garden, and he even had a little clam garden that he, as a child, had created and maintained. It was an amazing experience to go there with Kim and Adam, with Kim's brother, Chief Mark Kricalma, with my friend Doug Doer, and with Maya Neath, Dr. Daisy Seward Smith. We all went out and saw for ourselves and harvested the clams. and cooked them in bentwood boxes, and could see very well this amazing tending system and creating a habitat that was ideal for butter clams. And there they are, forkful. And like with the seeds, with the roots that I'll talk about camas in a minute, but you never take the little seed clams, Daisy said. You leave those, and you only take the biggest clams that are down the deepest. You leave the little ones behind. And it's just a continuous production system, because the little seed clams, if you go back in a few years' time, will be growing and doing really well because the sand is being churned up and nutrients are being cycled through the sand and so forth. So there are lots of things written about clam gardens now, but it was Quetzalcoatl who was the one who really explained what they were all about. And then harvesting seaweed, I learned a lot. Oh gosh, the first seaweed I ever tasted was up in Alert Bay back in 1970 maybe. 1969, the year we were married. We lived in the residential school for a while in Alert Bay. And we went to visit Daisy's grandmother, and she gave us seaweed and tasted it. It was really an amazing taste. They call it tla'ask, and it has different names, but related names all up and down the coast as far as California. Tla'ask, Tla'kistan, Tla'kas, and so forth, right down the coast. Well, many years later, like in the early 2000s, I went to the Gitgat seaweed camp, and I learned about harvesting seaweed from Helen Clifton. And this is the main seaweed that people get. It's a Pyropia abbati, named after Isabella Abbott, who is a very well-known algologist. It's one of the many foods that people would get at Kiel, at the Gitgat seaweed camp. The halibut, of course, is harvested at the same time in the springtime around May. In fact, the month of May is called Halila Tla'ask, the month to gather seaweed. They'd also get chitons and salmon, spring salmon, and other foods. And the seaweed they dry, and then they serve it sprinkled on halibut soup. Halibut head soup, if you haven't had it, is one of the most delicious dishes in the world. And children are involved in the harvesting of the seaweed. They spread it out on the rocks to dry in squares, and then later on they reprocess it and dry it further. As Helen says, it's better when it's picked every year. It grows better. Like any plant, it has to be trimmed. It will grow stronger and better. It's just like any garden. It has to be tended. So if you pick it every year, it grows strong, and the next year it keeps coming back. If it isn't picked for a few years, then it's just rotted away on the rocks. So people would actually not only pick it once, and they pick the way they pick it, they hold their hands and pull on it and leave a little bit growing on the rock. And that will continue to grow from the base and produce a second harvest of seaweed, even in the same, about a month later. So they would pick the first batch of seaweed and they would take it up to Kitimat and other places and trade it. And then they'd come back to the seaweed camp and they'd pick a second batch. And that's what they would dry for themselves. And if they couldn't dry it, well, the problem is the month of May has been rainy in the last few decades because of climate change. And so April is sunny and May is rainy, and you're not allowed to pick seaweed in the rain. So if you get even the odd sunny day in May, people were picking seaweed and then taking it and putting it in the freezer and then waiting until August or so when there's some sunny weather and drying it, as Helen is doing here on the boardwalk, on overweighty grocery boxes. Seaweed, there are many seaweeds that grow in certain places, and each family had their camp and their special places where they would go for their own family seaweed. Fly Bay out at that point, the first place you go, and then you pick later seaweed. It's all the same, but it shifts from one place to another. And Helen uses this stinging nettle at the seaweed camp at Kiel to tell when the seaweed is big enough to pick, because they grow at the same rate. So she watches the stinging nettle, and when it gets to a certain height, she knows it's time, and the seaweed is going to be about ready to harvest. And they have to be the right tides too, because they need those low tides in the morning, in the early morning, in the month of May. So they go out early in the morning, and then they can bring the seaweed back and put it on the rocks to dry, turn it over about 3 o'clock, and by sundown it's dried and ready to pack away and to take back to Hartley Bay. They would completely pick over certain areas, certain rocks. A whole group would go out and clean one place, and the next time they'd go from there and they'd pick some more till they finished, got enough seaweed for everybody. It's just like any garden. It has to be tended. If you pick it every year, then it grows strong the next year. It keeps coming back. Oh, I mentioned this already, that women would get 2 crops of seaweed from the same place by going back a month later, and they kept the second growth for themselves because it was a finer seaweed. So she used to get, Helen would like to get about 700 pounds of seaweed. If I get close to that, then I'm happy. Helen is 96 or 97 years old now and still going strong, I understand. I hope to get back to see her soon. A wonderful, smart woman, and very, very nice. So, so they use some for gifts, and they keep it over winter, and they make seaweed soup, and they serve it at feasts. It's just, and it's one of the most nutritious foods in the world. We make them into squares, and the rocks are hot on the sun, so they would dry on one side, and then they turn them over, and then about 7:30 they bring them in. They trade their seaweed. They trade with the Niska and with the Haisla people of Kitimat area for ulican grease, because they don't get ulicans where they are, and for dried smoked ulicans as well. So for and for soap berries, that is, and Saskatoon berries. Some of the Nass River people like our seaweed, so we trade with them for some more grease. And then finally, just a little finish off with the just a bit of a description of the use of many berries and fruits. There's about 40 different species of berries that people use, and they look after their berry bushes, and they love them very much. So Adam talks about, and Daisy too, Mayanith, how we prune the berries, we weed it, we break the branches so they'll grow more later. A lot of people think we never touched the wild berries, but we did. We cultivated it, we pruned it, especially the guadams, the red huckleberries. When they finish picking the guadams, they prune them, they break the tops off. Same with the salmon berries. And they use fire to maintain certain areas and to renew the growth of berry bushes, among other things. Lots of plants actually grow better after a quick fire, not a really, really hot burning fire, but a very quick fire that would be lit every few years in a given area. One of the best descriptions of the use of fire is from the Lillooet elder Baptist Ritchie from Mount Currie, burning mountainsides for better crops. This is the English translation of the story that he told to linguist Leon Swoboda in the Lillooet language, in the Slatlimuk language. When it gets too bushy, then the ripe berries disappear and the roots like the scamach, the skimuta, squinquina disappear. The spring beauty, the yellow glacier lily and the tiger lily, they disappear. Then they burned. It was marked out, and there one did his own burning. When they used to burn that grass above timberline, they used to say the Indian potatoes were as big as your fist. Now they're only like marbles because they're not cultivated. And I was up in his area, or up around just north of Lillooet, a few years back when there had been a fire up one of the hillsides, and I couldn't believe it. The wild onions there were over 1 meter tall. Usually they'd be about, a third of 1 meter. But after the fire, they were just huge. I couldn't believe it. Sam Mitchell from Hatlip talked about burning too. They'd burn every 5 or 6 years. Now it's only timber grows that takes away from the other. They burned at Lillooet to make the raspberries, and west of Lillooet for the huckleberries. I can still hear him saying that. And Annie York, lots of huckleberries. I can hear her. They wait until close to fall. They know just when to burn. And 2 or 3 years after, lots of huckleberries, lots of blueberries. The scamach, that's when it grows, when you burn. I've seen it when the old people used to do it. I was just a little girl. I'd go up the mountain with Granny. After we'd pick berries, my uncle would say, it's going to rain pretty soon, time to burn. So he stays up after we finished, and then we go back the next year, it's all burned. I actually wrote a book chapter called Time to Burn after that quote. That's published in a book called Indians, Fire and the Land, edited by Robert Boyd, Oregon University Press. Just been reprinted, a new version, a new edition. And Adam Dick again. Everybody had their own berry patches, just like everybody had their own clam beds. Things like salal, salmon berries, on all that. All kinds of berries, wild crabapple. You don't just go out and pick. There's certain places that a certain family goes. One family goes here, the other families go there. They have markers for the crabapples, pegs. So you pick these little sticks and you peg around the tree. Anything that's pegged, you know it belongs to someone. Saskatoon berry and what was very valued and was looked after and pruned and burned down, coppiced sometimes to make it more productive. And many different varieties were recognized of Saskatoon berries. Crabapple, owned and tended by individuals. They were just talking about that up in Hartley Bay not that long ago. And Spencer Greening, who was a Gitcat man who just defended his PhD successfully this last week, talked about the crabapples that grow up the Qual River in Old Town in the Gitcat territory. And individual trees and patches or stands of trees were owned by chiefs and matriarchs. And they looked after them from one generation to the next. Many different varieties were named and had different tastes and so forth. And they were widely appreciated as the chief's food. Same with high bush cranberries. Very favorite food in many places. And bushes were pruned were transplanted and patches were owned by chiefs and matriarchs. And I was visiting long ago Emma Nice, Harry and Deanna Nice's, Harry Nice Sr.'s mother, a wonderful, beautiful woman who's passed away now, but her yard was filled with all kinds of different berry bushes and crabapple and elderberry and black hawthorn and Saskatoon, strawberries, raspberries, and so on. I could go on about all the plants that were growing right around their yard. And her grandfather brought them there, transplanted them, because her grandmother, who was blind, loved to pick berries. So he brought them so she was able to pick berries, even though she wasn't able to get out into the forest to do that. And I mentioned already about the Heiltsuk berry gardens. And again, people would transplant bushes to those particular areas where by a waterfall where they get constantly moist soils, and on a south-facing slope where they get lots of sunshine. And that's the ideal place to grow your berries. And finally, my friend Dr. Chelsea Geralda Armstrong, working with her Tsimshian and Giksan friends, and as well as others from further south, has been able to identify a host of what she calls orchard gardens, combinations of berry bushes, medicine plants, herbaceous plants like rice root and ginger root, devil's club, crabapple, elderberry, highbush cranberry, rice root, as I mentioned, stinging nettles, growing all together in old village sites and old campsites. And these she's called orchard gardens, and has started to write about them quite a bit. So they're places where all of these different practices come together. And one of the really neat ones that I've worked on is on North Hunter Island at a place called Hoyat in Heiltsuk territory, where there are berry gardens, there are crab apples, there are salmon ponds, they're out on the coast, there are clam gardens. It's just a beautiful combination of integrated multi-resource management that is part of this ancient village site there at Hoyat. Makes me smile just to look at it and to think about the richness of what's being produced there at Hoyat. Stinging nettle, the tallest stinging nettle I've ever seen, found by Fiona Chambers, one of my former graduate students. Culturally modified trees, you can see that. Gooseberries, huge ones, and all kinds of other berries as well, found there. And finally, the Tequilak root gardens, back when Adam was talking about earlier, and I won't repeat this, but when you continue digging the soft ground, it will grow better every year, fertilizing, cultivating. Every family had pigs. They owned their little plots in the flats. The clover, and again from Curtis, clover is very valuable. The roots are regarded as indispensable for good health. For this reason, the land is well cared for. In the Kitlope Valley, Margaret and Stephen actually transplanted clover to the Kitlope Valley, and I was able to go and see it where they'd planted it, and it's still growing there all these years later. So they got it wrong. People were not hunter-gatherers. People didn't believe we did this. They think that nature just grows on its own, Mayanuth says. But our people felt to get more harvest and bigger berries, they did these things. Same thing a farmer does. The newcomers were blind to these practices, as you can see from Joseph Tretch, the infamous Joseph Tretch, who said, They assume to exercise ownership, but of which they make no real use, and they prevent settlement and cultivation. So today, whether we're looking at all kinds of impacts from our overuse, our lack of relationship with our home places, and at the same time with the residential schools and the impacts of colonization, there's been a loss of cultural knowledge, and yet this knowledge is so important, and it isn't really lost. It's sleeping in some cases, and it's being restored gradually. Thank goodness for people. For people like Tom and like Caleb and like Lorna Williams and so many others, the elders I've taught to, this knowledge is not gone. We just need to relearn it. All of us, we need to learn our relationships with our home places. Just a last very sad thing to learn about for marine educators. The best clam beach on Vancouver Island was said to be exactly where the Empress Hotel is in Victoria today. So we can all work towards renewing and restoring and revitalizing this knowledge, recognizing it, learning about it, practicing it, and recognizing the knowledge keepers and the knowledge holders. With careful observation, experimentation, collaboration, sharing, and recognition of Indigenous peoples' knowledge and rights, much can be done to restore these practices and enhance the growth, productivity, and quality of people's foods, materials, and medicines. So these are just some of the, I guess, the keys. Connect with communities and places, recognize the holistic relationships and interactions, instill gratitude, accountability, and responsibility, value and support diversity, embrace different teaching approaches and learning styles, biocultural renewal, and think about the old and the new and bring them together, and use both of them in any ways that you can. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry I went a little bit over, but I hope it's still okay, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was fabulous. Great stories and very personal. So thank you for sharing that with us. I would love to open it up to questions. If anyone has questions for Nancy, feel free to write them in the chat and I can read them out. Or if you prefer, you can just unmute yourself and ask, or you can raise your hand and we can get to you that way.
React.
I see Meredith has her hands up.
Hello, good evening. And Nancy, thank you. And to all of the people who have taught you. I could listen to you forever and ever, I think. So that was just a joy to hear little bits of the different adventures and things you've learned along the way. My question, the first question I have, which I'll just stay with that for right now, is trying to parse out the difference between proprietorship and ownership and sort of Western worldviews of that. So I am a Western settler person, and I see responsibility. I can see responsibility in there and care and generational things, but I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that to help me understand.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. Stewardship comes to mind. We talk about ownership, but it's really, I think my friend Richard Atleo would would agree or would support this idea that it's more that you have the responsibility, you've inherited the responsibility to look after a certain place, or a certain species sometimes, or a certain type of organism, or I guess. And I think again of Richard Atleo and how the Atleo River was the place that he needed to look after. From the time he was little, he knew that. And my friend Earl McQuina George, also from a house at, he wrote a book actually about his life, and he did his master's, which was essentially the book. But I remember him telling me how even as a little child, as a 2-year-old or so, he was brought by his elders to the Shark Creek, where that was his hahotli. That was where he was intended to look after that watershed. And he was taken up, right up the river to the lake that began the river, and by people who knew about these and taught about it. And then it was from that time on, he was the one who was supposed to care for it. And at the same time, he would be training people who would take over from him, the next generation. So it was a continuing process of stewardship and looking after places that was a lifelong responsibility for an individual, but was far more than that, because it had to pass through generations. Does that help answer?
It definitely is making, yes, it does. And it's definitely making some good connections in my head. One is, I guess, the poet Gary Snyder talked about something we can do to help the climate or planet. And he just said 2 words: stay put. And I think that's something that's missing from my cultural background. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. And then I think Morgan has their hand up. So Morgan, you have a question.
Lugo Ndoyikchen, Nancy, thank you very much. I wanted to ask who the woman was that you're referring to from Kitsum Kalem. And then I also wanted to ask, as I'm an Indigenous science teacher in the LeConner High School working for Swinomish, what resources you might recommend for bringing our children into some of these conversations and teachings and into the classroom.
Oh, thank you, Morgan. The woman I was referring to was Dr. Chelsea Armstrong, and she worked with a number of colleagues, leaders in the Kitsum Kalem area, but also others, about these forest gardens. And if you want, you're welcome to just email me, nturner@uvic.ca, and I can send you some of her papers and some of her work. And now the second part of your question was about, would you mind repeating it again, Morgan, about teaching?
Of course, yeah. So I work with high school age youth, and I'm always trying to find ways to make these kind of conversations or teachings accessible for them. And I'm wondering if you know of any resources or ideas, or even other people doing that work.
You know, when I was teaching ethnobotany at the University of Victoria, one of the things that I really enjoyed, and I think the students did too, I mean, getting them outside and getting them out and just being in nature and not just in the classroom is really important, for one thing. But also, one of the things that we did with the students in the Gitgat Nation at Hartley Bay, it's similar to what I did with my students at university, to assign each student a plant or an animal or something to do their own research on, so that they become connected to that one plant, whether it's a crab apple or whatever, a root vegetable. They do research about it, and if they're able to, go and talk to their elders, or go and talk to people who know about it. Go to a museum and talk to somebody, and then have them give a talk about it in the class, and then bring all of that together into a booklet that the students, you can make copies for everyone in the class. In the case of the Gitgat Nation, we did a book called Plants of the Gitgat, where the students had their own articles within the book on the different plants. And that was a really great way of getting them out and talking to people and asking questions, and then having something to show for it, something that you're proud of to take home and show that, this is what we did together. This is what I did, and this is what we all did together, and learn from each other as you go. So in the Gitgat Nation, we had the students actually host the elders and have a tea for them and bake, and then invite them, and then give presentations on the plants and the teachings that they gave. So that's just one example of what could be done. But getting students out into the wild and just spending time looking and observing and getting to know the plants and animals as if they're your relatives, which they are. Get to know their names and get familiar with them. And that will, I think that interest will stay with them.
Direction. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Morgan. We have a question in the chat from Sue, and she's wondering if Indigenous communities farmed salmon, and did different communities restore salmon habitat?
I'm no expert on salmon. I've never heard of people farming salmon, but I know that people all up and down the coast and in the interior are extremely knowledgeable about salmon, their needs and their requirements. And a lot of what we think of as like fish traps and fish weirs were actually built and put in place not so much to catch the salmon, but to allow people to observe the salmon as they went up to the rivers to spawn, or oolakans or other fish as well. And so having places where you could actually observe the salmon and see the big ones, make sure that the biggest, healthiest fish get through and are able to go ahead and spawn. So it's sort of a selection process, similar in a way to the clams, I guess, where you pick certain ones and you leave certain ones behind to continue to grow. And so that's what they did with salmon and with other species as well. Just very, very careful kind of harvesting, but thinking always of the leaders of those groups, the animal groups, and never killing the biggest or the strongest ones.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sue, for the question. And then we have another question from the chat. This one is from Gary, who's wondering if any work has been done on whether the Western red cedar, many of which are suffering drought and extreme heat, can handle bark stripping.
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really worried about our cedar trees, and we've seen a number of them dying off in places where they've been growing for a long time. And so I'd say you never should try to strip bark from cedars that are growing in drier places. just observe carefully the cedars that if they look stressed, they probably are. And if they're growing in a dry place, they're probably drought stressed. But there's still cedars growing along rivers and around the edges of lakes that won't have been suffering so much from drought. And it's probably safe to harvest the bark from trees like that if you're very careful and you're very selective.
Thanks, Nancy. That was from me.
Thanks.
Thank you. There's no other questions in the chat. Is there anyone else who has their hand up? Gloria.
I'm just wondering, can you think of examples of indigenous uses of mushrooms or lichens?
Oh my goodness, Gloria. Actually, I'll send you my friend Alain Courier and I. He's an ethnobotanist, ethnoecologist from Université de Montréal, and he and I just co-authored a paper a couple of years ago about indigenous people's use of mushrooms and fungi from across Canada, and I'll send you that paper. There were quite a few uses of mushrooms, which I could go into, but it would take a long time. But I'm happy to share that paper with you. And if you look in our Thompson, there's a couple. We've written a paper on the cottonwood mushroom, Trichiloma populinum, and its use. Also, Ainonotus obliquus, the chaga fungus has some specific uses. And lichens, especially the black tree lichen, Bryoria, is a food species for interior peoples. It has to be pit cooked, and it's got a lot of knowledge that goes with it. And there are many lichens that are used for medicine. And just the very last detail I'll tell you is that the old man's beard lichen, Usnea, has antibiotic properties, and I've seen it be used very successfully to reverse a very bad infection caused by a needle being used for intravenous medicine in hospital, and a person's arm got really badly infected, and using a compress of Usnea overnight reduced the swelling to it just disappeared. So there are lots of different uses of lichens and fungi for sure. Some of you might like to know the I belong to the board of a group called the Fungi Foundation. It's an international foundation, and you can look it up on the web. See, there are efforts to raise the awareness of the importance of fungi, mycelial fungi and fungi in a whole range of uses, to become as aware of fungi as they are of plants and animals in the world, because they're also really important.
And can you just repeat the name of who wrote that paper and maybe spell it?
The paper on
I think the paper that you had mentioned earlier.
Oh, myself and Alain, Alain, Courier, Cuerrier.
Perfect.
It's in the journal Botany, published in Botany.
Great.
I'll just mention this past week I was talking to a fellow who burned his finger quite badly, and he told me that he had already made a salve from old man's beard, and it just absolutely healed that burn before it could even look bad. I mean, like, he even showed me his finger where it was just slightly pink, but he said that he burned it really badly, and it should have just turned into a really bad burn. So that's kind of interesting.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that.
Any other questions for Nancy?
I'll ask another one.
Sure.
I probably like a million infinite questions for Nancy. I wanted to ask, so I'm actually going up to Kitsim-Kalem to visit some of our relatives, and we're going to
Oh.
seaweed camp out on next week. And my
Oh.
friend, she lives here, and she's they do the Kitsim-Kalem some Alyak language learners group, and she is just now getting really, really into plants. And I going up there myself and also thinking of her, was wondering if you know of any folks that would be good to connect her with up there.
I'd have to give it some thought. I could ask Chelsea Armstrong because she knows the folks there much better than I do. And I mentioned Spencer Greening. He has relatives up that way as well. So if you want to send me an email, that's probably the best, and then I can see what I can do to help and advise.
Okay, Deutschen.
Perfect. And I think probably in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap up tonight. But Nancy has given her email. And if you could just repeat that one more time, Nancy, for any
Sure.
further questions.
Yeah, it's just N Turner, all lowercase, no spaces or anything. N Turner at uvic.ca.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, I'd like to thank you for speaking tonight and for your wonderful stories. And I would like to leave everyone with two reminders. One of them is that we will have another talk next month on Monday, May 20th. And I believe that will be Brian Timmer speaking about kelp. And I would also like to let you know and remind you that we are also having an in-person conference at Pearson College in Machosen on the South Island here this summer, August 10th through 12th. And so we hope that you'll follow us on social media and our website. We'll be opening registration in early May, and we really hope to see a lot of new faces at our conference. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah.